There are 4 settings on a camera that you need to learn, and if you learn them well, you will master your cinematography. And today we're going over shutter speed. It's my goal on this channel to help you simplify your filming so you can stand out on YouTube and become successful. So take that first step by hitting the subscribe button and the bell notification so you're not missing any steps or tips that we're taking. So what is shutter speed? On every camera, there is a shutter, and that shutter used to be a physical object. It used to be a circular device, like you see on the screen here, and it would open and expose light to the film, and then close. Expose light to the film. It was also known as shutter angle, because the wider the shutter angle, the longer the exposure. Shutter speed represents how fast that spins. Now, obviously, in our digital cameras today, we don't use a physical device like that anymore. It's basically, shutter speed is now representative of how often the photo sights on your sensor turn on and turn off to collect data. If you want to do more research on shutter speeds and in depth to find out the science behind it, that's great. It's fascinating stuff. But this video is going to give you just practical tips of what shutter speeds you should be shooting in as a content creator. Shutter speeds are usually defined and signified by these types of numbers. The first one represents how many frames, it represents one frame, and how many times the shutter opens up, or how many times your sensor is going to collect data per frame. And as I mentioned in a previous video that I'll link at the end about frame rate, you should be always just simply doubling your shutter speed to your frame rate. If you're shooting in 24 frames a second, try to get to between 50 and 60. If you're going to be shooting in 30, make sure it is 60. That will give you the most consistent look. You get 2 exposures per frame. So let's take a real quick look. Look what happens when I'm shooting at 24 frames a second. You see the motion blur. However, when I bump up or triple the shutter speed, you'll see a drastic difference in the look of the motion blur, and the exposure, which brings us to my next point and a major warning to you guys. Because motion and the look of your footage is so important not to be jarring, you never use your shutter speed as a way to expose. Now, what I mean by expose is making sure you have the right amount of light on your image to create a good, clean image. Bad exposure looks like this, underexposed looks like this. Never roll your shutter speed to adjust that. And here's the reason why. First of all, if I'm shooting it like this, and then suddenly it looks like this, the motion looks entirely different. That's why you never want to use shutter speed to expose that. Here's another reason why. If I'm slowly changing my shutter speed like this, look what happens to the light. That's not good, because most light bulbs flicker. If you didn't know that, there you go. The light surges into the light and turns off, surges into the light and turns off. And if you're bumping your shutter speed up enough that gets close enough to match that, you're going to start seeing a flicker in your footage, and that will kill your footage. But most light manufacturers know that, so they try to keep it into the hundreds per second of how many times it flickers. So you're usually safe if you just follow that rule of thumb. Whatever your frame rate is, double your shutter speed. Never use your shutter speed to expose, and then whatever your frame rate is, just double your shutter speed. And then just forget about shutter speed. Okay? And your footage will always look consistent forever. Now, if you're shooting on a phone, typically you don't have access by default to your shutter, and it does use shutter to expose, which gives you lines like this in your video. That's why I'd recommend researching and downloading for whatever device you have a custom camera control app that will allow you to control your shutter speed, giving you the highest quality you can achieve. So hopefully that was helpful information. And if you want that video on frame rate, it's going to be right here. And don't forget, in the meantime, always be creating. You're still not clicking on one. I'll just be silent like this until you do.